Our second session of the day is exciting new development in cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. Our presenter for this session is Dr. Jeremy Schmahmann. Dr. Schmahmann is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and is a neurologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he is the founding director of the Ataxia Unit. Dr. Schmahmann is also a member of the National Ataxia Foundation's Medical Research Advisory Board. Let's head on out to Boston. Dr. Schmahmann.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you so much to NAF for inviting me to join the conference this year to talk about the cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. I'm sorry that we're not together, but I look forward to being together soon when this is all over. This is the disclaimer from NAF that we would like to share with you. And my own disclaimers are the books I'll be mentioning and some of the consulting that is relevant to ataxia, but there are no conflicts with the current presentation. So let's just jump right in. And our topic is the cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. So here's an image of the cerebellar histology. And as you know, the cerebellum is Latin for little brain. And what I'd like to leave you with at the time we're done with the talk today is that this is little brain, big deal. Okay, that's the message of the talk. Going back probably 200 years, we've had this notion that the cerebellar clinical syndrome is what we have thought of as ataxia. Gait ataxia, trouble with controlling the arms and the legs, trouble with speech, trouble controlling the eye movements. But again, at the end of the talk, if you haven't figured this out already from the work to date, you will know that the cerebellar clinical syndrome of ataxia is in fact the cerebellum motor syndrome of motor ataxia, and there's much more to cerebellum than motor control. This is the 30th year anniversary, so to speak, of a paper that I wrote in 1991 called An Emerging Concept, the Cerebellar Contribution to Higher Function. And in that paper, I introduced the concept of dysmetria of thought. And the bottom line is that the cerebellum does the same thing for thinking and emotion as it does for motor control. That's dysmetria of thought. Putting it into more specific language, in the same way the cerebellum regulates the rate and the rhythm and the force and the accuracy of our movements, it does the same thing to regulate the speed, the consistency, the capacity, and the appropriateness of our mental or cognitive processes. And so the inability to check the parameters of movement, or the motor ataxia, are equated with a mismatch between reality and perceived reality and erratic attempts to correct errors of thought or behavior. And that's the basis of the cerebellar contribution to cognition. Now, the dysmetria of thought theory is based on the notion of the universal cerebellar transform. And that is that the cerebellum, because the way the cerebellum is built is consistent throughout, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the cerebellum optimizes performance. It makes things better by modulating behavior around a homeostatic baseline, automatically, implicitly, and according to context. So that's the idea about the cerebellum transforming information to which it has access. And like the old commercial from years ago, the cerebellum doesn't make things, it makes things better. Now, a corollary of the universal cerebellar transform idea is that if the cerebellum doesn't work, it then should break down in the same way throughout. And that the lesions or damage to the sensory motor cerebellum produces dysmetria of movement, that's the cerebellar motor syndrome of ataxia that you know, but that lesions of the parts of cerebellum involved in emotion and thinking is the basis of dysmetria of thought and emotion, the cause of the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. Now, the reason I'm starting with this is because the ideas of dysmetria of thought and the universal cerebellar transform are the structural and theoretical underpinnings of what's become this vast field of the cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. Now, the dysmetria of thought theory rests on two complementary realities of cerebellar organization. The first is the idea that there's an essentially invariant architecture of the cerebellar cortex. The cortex looks about the same throughout, set against the other idea that there's a rich heterogeneity of cerebellar connections with structures outside the cerebellum, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the cerebral hemispheres themselves. Well, let's jump into this now. You've all seen in the ataxia world these kind of images, the cerebellum on MRI. This is the three cardinal planes, called the coronal, the sagittal, the axial. You see the cerebellum and all of its different structures. You can see it on MRI. This is a high-resolution imaging postmortem showing the nuclei. And here's a structure in concept form of the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum with its nuclei and its white matter. Now, if you look at the cortex of the cerebellum itself, we've known for over 100 years that there is a three-layered cortex. It consists of a molecular layer, a Purkinje neuron layer, and a granule cell layer. And here's a Purkinje neuron and different staining techniques. You can show all kinds of antibodies that produce different kinds of patterns within the Purkinje cells themselves. But the architecture of the cortex is pretty much the same throughout. There are some interesting new ideas about this. There is a parasagittal stripes zonation in the cerebellum using different staining techniques that have relevance for connectivity and probably for some functional variation as well. You can use new monoclonal antibodies to really highlight the white matter in the cerebellum, the granule cell layer, and the Purkinje cell layer. And remember that the granule cells comprise about 80% of all the brain cells that we have, an enormous computing power in the cerebellum. Technological advances in imaging allow us to see how the pons down here conveys information into the cerebellum. And here's the pontocerebellar fibers with diffusion imaging. You can see the fibers within the cerebellum itself and even within the cerebellar cortex. So we can really have a deeper understanding of the structures within the cerebellum that allow the cerebellum to do what it does. Let's step back a moment and look at the cerebellum from a broader perspective. Not just that beautiful MRI we saw, but actually understanding the components within the cerebellum itself. We can define the fissures that separate one part of the cerebellum from another. Here they are in space and against the cerebellum itself. And they separate out the different little fronds of tissue called these are the lobules within the cerebellum. And we can now, through imaging, identify exactly where we are in the cerebellum so we're not stuck trying to figure out exactly how the cerebellum is related to different functions or properties. Here's the upside down brain. The cerebellum here now is front and center, the way I like to think about cerebellum. And remember that the cerebellum is talking to the cerebral hemispheres over here in a very precise manner. Multiple regions of cerebral cortex involved in all kinds of brain functions, which we'll come to in a minute. This is our first flattened map of cerebellum, which has relevance for where we're going in the slides coming up. You can flatten cerebellum to get a sense of the anterior lobe, which is over here, lobules 1 through 5. There's 10 lobules altogether. The cerebellar posterior lobe is a massive expansion of cerebellum through evolution, much bigger posterior lobe, lateral hemispheres in humans than in other animals. And then the floccular nodular lobe. So the anterior, posterior, and floccular nodular lobes. And I'll draw attention to the anterior lobe and lobule 8B over here, which you'll be seeing in the future slides, and all of the rest of this posterior lobe story. In the connections of the cerebral hemispheres to and from the cerebellum, this is just one slide as a summary to show how when you make injections of traces in an animal, in a monkey, and you see how the connections are from cerebral cortex to the pons. Here's a cerebral cortex with different traces color-coded by the lobules. Look at the pattern of projections to the pons over here, and you'll see a rich mosaic of interconnections from the prefrontal cortex in purple, which is important for planning and organizing and sequencing and strategy formation, and the blue, which is from the parietal lobe involved in spatial awareness, and the red in terms of importance for language from the temporal lobe, and their projections from the cingulate gyrus, which are important for emotional processing. So this kind of patterning of projections from the cortex to the pons, you will see this map coming up later in other kinds of avenues. Now the cerebellum feeds back to cerebral cortex as well through the deep nuclei. And the one-liner on this is that the dentate nucleus projects not only to the motor regions, but to the prefrontal cortex as well. And the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum are linked in a very precise manner. The motor cortex in the cerebral hemispheres is talking to the cerebellar anterior lobe and lobule 8 of the cerebellum. But the prefrontal cortex has projections to and from cerebellum to the cerebellar posterior lobe. This is a double dissociation, a dichotomy of motor to anterior lobe and lobule 8, prefrontal or other high order areas to the cerebellar posterior lobe, crus 1 and crus 2. Now, I mentioned the nuclear projection back to cerebral cortex. We know from recent work that if you look at the fastigial nucleus right smack in the middle of the cerebellum, which is very old, and you look at its connections through optogenetic manipulation and through genetic analysis of the different neurons within the fastigial nucleus, it has linkages with a number of different functional properties. Posture and motor control, so important for balance, important for eye movement control, important for autonomic control, but also for arousal, vigilance, hippocampal regions for memory, motivation, intention. And the fastigial nucleus, therefore, is linked to different parts of the fastigial, are linked with parts of the cerebral hemispheres that are quite widely ranging in their functions, including emotional processing and motivation and awareness and arousal. There is an interesting and important little structure called the ventral tegmental area, which is in the brainstem, in the midbrain. And the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, is part of what's called the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. It's long been known to have widespread projections in this schematic throughout the cerebral hemispheres, and is important for reward and motivation and social behavior. And for a long time, we've known that the cerebellum, the fastigial nucleus, has a connection to the VTA. But recent work, again, using this optogenetic activation in a live mouse running around in its little cage, you can change the circuitry of the fastigial nucleus to the ventral tegmental area, and you can change the socialized behavior of the mouse. So by manipulating the circuit, linking cerebellar nucleus, fastigial, with the VTA, which is part of the reward circuitry, you can change the behavior of a mouse in a socially directed manner. Now, if you go from small mice to big mice, namely us, people, if somebody has a stroke in the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, over here, the manifestation is the cerebellar motor syndrome. So the problem here, from the stroke in the anterior lobe, is a cerebellar motor syndrome. But if you have a stroke that spares the anterior lobe and gets a cerebellar posterior lobe down here, what you have is not a motor syndrome, but the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So what is that? We described this over 20 years ago now, and we showed that if you have a lesion or problem down in the posterior lobe of cerebellum, the deficits that manifest are in the range of executive function, planning, set shifting, verbal fluency, abstract reasoning, working memory. How you think, how you strategize, how you form all the plans that are necessary to live a normal life. Spatial cognition, spatial organization, and memory for visual spatial information. Language problems, how you find words, how you structure your language, how you use language for discourse and for conversation. And personality change was altered from midline lesions involving the fastigial nucleus and the cerebellar vermis. And both in adults and children, there's a change in the affect, the emotional state, the disinhibition, inappropriate behaviors. And this has become a big piece of the affective component of the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, which is now the third cornerstone of clinical ataxiology, along with the motor system and with the vestibular system. The cognitive affective syndrome has been replicated across the world in a number of different circumstances, adults and children, many diseases. And we now have a scale that can detect this in the office or at the bedside to be helpful to patients and families so the clinicians can diagnose these issues and help recognize them and work with the problems that arise. And as you heard me say before, it gives people and their families a sense that the emotional or cognitive issues are not in their head, they're actually in their brain. This is a result of the damage. If you use functional imaging, you can develop some really interesting detailed understanding of the organization of cerebellum. In a meta-analysis, going back to 2009 now, we looked at a number of studies of cerebellum and functional MRI in cognitive performance and showed that there was a difference in terms of where the motor system is located in the anterior lobe and lobule 8 of cerebellum I showed you earlier, and language representation, spatial cognition, and working memory. So these are located in different parts of the cerebellum. And it's true not only in an analysis of many different past studies, a single individual, we showed in 2010 for the first time, within a single individual, the motor system, the language system, spatial awareness, and working memory are in different parts of the cerebellum. And in our group study, we replicated the finding. Now, not everybody was exactly the same. That turns out to be important. But there was an overall match of the group, the case, and the meta-analysis of the motor system, the language system, spatial awareness, and working memory. And here's a single case where you can see in the cross-section of one level of the cerebellum where these are located: motor system, spatial, language, and working memory. There's been a lot of work on this over the years since that time. And here's a remarkable series of findings where people who were doing task-based MRI, lying in the scanner and doing something and then seeing how the cerebellum activated, were mapped onto this flattened map of the cerebellum. And we have a story that's now you're familiar with, that's emerging. Here, this is the anterior lobe up the top. And these different green and turquoise colors are the motor system. And down here in lobule 8 is also motor system. But all of the rest of the cerebellum lights up with different kind of tasks. Action, observation, watching someone do something, divided attention, word comprehension, remembering information from one's past, verbal fluency, listening to a story, divided attention, eye movement control. And so here in this flattened map of many individuals and their different task activations, we see a rich complexity of functions that are the repertoire of human behavior mapped onto the cerebellum. And extending from the task-based activation is a concept called resting state connectivity, where using the way that the blood flow varies in the different parts of the brain, you can see how the brain is wired up at the physiological level. And what we see is that there are networks in the cerebral hemisphere, networks that show motor system, and then these are dorsal attention, ventral attention, a frontoparietal network perhaps involved in control, and the red is the default network, which is important for inner thought and reflective behavior and creativity and imagination. See how these reflect on the cerebellum. The motor system is the anterior lobe and lobule 8, but the rest of the cerebellum is all these other different tasks, which you can see here in the flattened representation. The motor system in the anterior lobe and lobule 8, and everything else shown here in the massive expanded posterior lobe that we see in the human. Now, we have known for a long time, from work going back to the 1940s, that there is a double representation of motor control in the cerebellum, the anterior lobe and lobule 8, that's the motor system. But now, through imaging, both task-based and resting state connectivity, we see that there is a triple representation of cognitive processing. 3 different separate representations. Why we have that is not entirely clear, but it's becoming a reality. So here, for example, in the task-based activation versus resting state, this is people doing something in the scanner. This is seeing how the blood flow differentiates one area from another, just as you're lying quietly in the scanner. We see the motor representations as expected, primary and secondary. But if you're listening to a story or you're doing a working memory paradigm, the motor regions don't light up, but the posterior lobe cognitive regions do, and they seem to locate in different places, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Just in the last month, we have this study that shows the single individual, 2 different individuals who were scanned, I think, 31 times. So very high resolution scanning because of all that averaging. And what you see is a map within the cerebral hemispheres of a whole range of different functional networks, the sensory motor, the dorsal attention, the control systems, the default systems, the language systems, and the map that you now have come to recognize of this distribution of motor in the anterior lobe and lobule 8B, as opposed to everything else with all the other cognitive domains. looks somewhat the same between the two individuals, but it's not exactly the same. And so now we have an intra-individual topography in the human cerebellum, as you have in the cerebral hemispheres. And why would that not be? Nobody is exactly the same as somebody else. And so the brain is structured and wired up in such a way that is somewhat different from one person to the other as well. You can change the networks in the cerebral hemisphere upstairs by doing stimulation of the cerebellum downstairs. So using transcranial magnetic stimulation applied to different regions of the cerebellum, either the midline vermis or the lateral hemisphere, you can change the networks that I've just shown you upstairs. And what this pretty picture is showing us is that if you look at the EEG recordings or the gamma oscillations on the EEG, the way that you change the brain is the same, but it's in different locations depending on where you stimulate in the cerebellum. So this is an empirical test, an experimental test of the dysmetria of thought theory that's based on the universal cerebellar transform. Cerebellum does the same thing to different information to which it has access. We then took these observations, and this is now 11 years ago in 2010, tried to see whether we could make a difference by stimulating the cerebellum to the very troubling behaviors that characterize schizophrenia. And by targeting the cerebellar vermis, we were able to show, firstly, that it was safe, and secondly, that there was an improvement in particularly the negative symptoms of schizophrenia that are so disabling. And this is a study that has been replicated now a few times and opens the opportunities for cerebellum modulation of the brain networks upstairs in neuropsychiatric disorders. This has relevance in a number of different circumstances. This is work showing autism has cerebellar signatures to it. This has been known for some time, but the work is ongoing. And here we see that there is reduced gray matter in CRUS1, which is a cognitive region, and vermis lobule 9, which is probably an emotional region, in the cerebellum in autism. And the reduced gray matter in these kids with autism matches some scales for social behavior, social communication, social interaction, and stereotype behaviors. That's in the gray matter volume reduction. And using connectivity measures with functional connectivity, the people who have autism have a heightened connectivity with a part of the brain called the inferior parietal lobule. This speaks to something wrong with the hyperconnectivity because it's different than the healthy control. So the connectivity and the gray matter volume are different in autism, speaking to a cerebellar signature in autism, which is such a pervasive problem. And this has relevance in little children who have cerebellar hemorrhages in utero. Going back now a number of years, we have learned that in addition to some of the motor problems that may occur in children with hemorrhage in the cerebellum in utero, they also have changes in language, in behavior, and they have autism scores in over 40%. So this relationship of early infantile damage produces changes in cerebellar function that extend beyond motor control and involve neurobehavior. If you look at Medline and you type in the word cerebellum, you get over 91,000 papers that go back to the earliest report they have here from 1804. But if you type in cerebellum and the word cognition, you get almost 7,000 papers, which is about 7.5% of the total. And these go back to about 1970. So the field is rapidly expanding, but this is still a long way from what you'll see in the next slide, which is when you ask you all in the ataxia community to tell us about the symptoms that you have in what's now called the patient-reported outcome measure for ataxia, or PROM-ataxia, which is about to be published. We see that of the 1,845 items that you told us were relevant to you from the physical domain, activities domain, and mental health domain, almost 19% were relevant for emotional dysfunction and social health. So it's not quite, this is a difference between the 7% of the papers, but that's only since the 1970s. So this is a problem that we need to face and recognize because of the role of cerebellum in non-motor function and how it plays out in health, in healthy controls and in people who have diseases. Now, just a couple of words on where the field has moved. There are a number of consensus papers, just so you have a sense of where this has come. Here's a study on the pediatric cerebellar mutism syndrome, or postoperative cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. Children who've had cerebellar tumors taken out have a problem of behavioral change, and their language shuts down shortly after surgery. And there's now a deeper understanding of how that works and where the damage is that produces that syndrome. And there are consensus papers on cerebellum and perceptual processing, cerebellum and language, cerebellum and social cognition, and the task force on the cognitive affective syndrome. That now is the basis of our understanding of the cerebellar contribution to emotion and cognition. And then finally, where this is going, we now know that the cognitive neuroscience of cerebellum tells us the cerebellar system and its neurobiology have relevance in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry in the ataxias, probably in Chiari malformation, certainly in cerebellar developmental disorders. It has relevance for autism, for schizophrenia, for depression, bipolar disorder, for obsessive compulsive disorder. Dyslexia seems to have a role. Social cognition is certainly important. And even in the dementias, which are so cerebral hemisphere based, like Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia, there is increasing recognition of the role of cerebellum in these disorders. And even at the level of physiology and genetics, the cerebellum is now becoming increasingly linked with the epilepsy syndrome and even ALS. So I'll end where I started, that the cerebellum is little brain, but big deal because of its motor, cognitive, and emotional consequences and the implications of cerebellar neurobiology, the new thinking of cerebellum, dysmetry of thought applied to motor systems, cognition, and emotion, giving us a sense of how cerebellum can help us understand the brain and lead to deeper understanding and better treatments for neurological and mental health diseases going forwards. And I'll end with this recognition of the many people who have worked with me over the years to help us get to the point that we are today. So I'll thank you for your time. I look forward to having any questions in the chat and look forward to seeing you again at the meeting in person next year. Take care, everybody, and thank you so much.